Perfect. Okay. I'm going to start the webinar in just a second. There we go. All right, in 3, 2, and 1. Hello, good afternoon. We're going to give people just a second to join. I see our numbers are ticking up here. We are glad you're here. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the UC Women in Technology Committee's inaugural International Women's Day Speaker Series. My name is Alyssa Tecklenburg. I'm the Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Department of Medicine in the School of Medicine at UCSF. I'm also a co-founder and leadership team member of Women in Tech at UCSF, which is our local chapter of UC WIT. And I am so thrilled to be hosting this closing event of this year's series. So if you're here to learn more about data feminism, you are in the right place. And thank you so much for spending your time with us on this important and very timely topic. If you are not yet familiar with WIT, this is the University of California's Women in Technology Committee. We are a self-chartered independent entity that promotes a supportive, inclusive environment to advance the professional goals and aspirations of women in technology. We are composed of volunteers from all the campuses, and we are from tons of different departments and functional roles, all supporting technology. Okay, and we would not have this event without our planning committee member. So I just wanted to shout out to this team, Caro Manel, who is from UC Irvine. She is the chair of UC WIT. Sharon Andrus, she's from UC Berkeley. She's our co-chair. Rita Rosenthal from UC Berkeley and Janae Blunt, also from UC Berkeley, are members. And Alyssa Tecklenburg, that's me. I'm from UCSF. All right, next we are going to do our land acknowledgement. So the University of California Women in Technology Committee recognizes that our service occurs on the unceded territory of the Indigenous peoples of California, and that these lands were and continue to be of great importance to them. Every member of our community has and continues to benefit from the use and stewardship of these lands. With respect and gratitude, we acknowledge and make visible our relationship to the original caretakers. And I mentioned this is a part of a series. If you were not able to join us on Monday for our kickoff event with Dr. Brandy Nonaki, have no fear, it is recorded. So we will be sending a follow-up email to all of the event participants, and we'll have links to the recordings of both of these events so that you can watch them later. Okay, and without further ado, let's get the party started. I would like to introduce Dr. Lauren F. Klein, who is a Winship Distinguished Research Professor and Associate Professor in the Departments of Quantitative Theory and Methods and English at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. Lauren works at the intersection of data science, AI, and the humanities with an emphasis on questions of gender and race. She is co-author with Catherine D'Ignacio of the award-winning book Data Feminism and co-editor of Debates in the Digital Humanities, among other publications. She's currently completing Data by Design, an interactive history of data visualization, forthcoming from MIT Press, and building the Atlanta Interdisciplinary AI Network, which launched in fall of 2023. Very impressive resume. Let's bring on Dr. Klein and we'll get the presentation started. Welcome, Dr. Klein. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. And thanks also to Caro, Janae, Sharon, and Rita for having me here, and for all of you for listening. I love everything about this. I love WIT. I love your acronym. I love your inclusive Women with an X. I love what you do. We were talking earlier about how I always thought my job would be somewhere in the ed tech space. And so I'm just really grateful for all of you inviting me here today and making the time to listen. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I assume I was invited here because of this book that you're looking at right now called Data Feminism, which was published in 2020. It was co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio, who you can see up here on the slide. And I guess one thing to note, it's actually available open access online in English and Spanish, as well as of today, to coincide with International Women's Day in Farsi, actually. And what we do in the book is present a set of principles for doing more just and equitable data science that are informed by the teachings of intersectional feminism. And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time. I would like to speak with you for only about 35 minutes and then have a longish Q&A. But what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about our motivation for writing the book and give you a little bit of a primer on the feminism that informs it. And then what I'm going to try to do is take some of the ideas that we articulated in the project and think about how they apply to the current conversation around AI, both its uses as well as its limits and even its harms, and try to think about the ways in which these principles in some ways align quite well, and in other ways need to be extended or reformulated. So I'm going to jump right in. Oh wait, before I get started, I'm just going to open the chat. You might all see this here, but I'm going to move it to the side so I can have a way of keeping track of what's going on. Okay, now hopefully that's out of your screen. Just to get started, as we were writing the book, we were increasingly aware that data was in the process of becoming a tremendous form of power. I think all of you were as well, right? We were all learning from researchers whose books you see up here on the screen. So Sophia Noble, UCLA, Virginia Eubanks, Julia Angwin, Surya Matu, the folks at ProPublica, Joy Buolamwini, the Algorithmic Justice League, Maggie Smith, and many, many more, Ruha Benjamin, many, many more whose books are not up here on the slide. But this was sort of the set of scholars and activists that we really felt inspired by and hoped to be in community with. And the reason was that all of this work was together pointing to the fact that data was incredibly powerful, but that power was being wielded unequally. And more specifically, it was, and for that matter, it remains, being wielded by a small and homogenous group of corporations and other well-resourced institutions who had the resources to design and deploy these data systems, mostly for their own profit, and usually also at the expense of everyone else. And this is really where we saw feminism entering in. And what we explain in the book is how feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, has actually been focused on precisely this issue. So on imbalances of power and the structural forces that cause them. This has been the central project of intersectional feminism for a really, really long time. So if you want to think about it in other terms, now we hear things like people talking about the brittleness of AI systems. So when they talk about brittleness, they mean that systems have been optimized for only certain situations or for only certain groups of users and not others. But the basic idea that systems, not technical systems, but all kinds of systems are optimized for certain groups and not others, like this is not news to feminists. Or you could take the issue of bias training data, which we hear about all the time. Again, the idea that biases are pretty much baked into the cultural record. Again, not just the scientific record, not just into algorithmic decision making, but just sort of baked into the way that we record information about our cultures. This is the ground truth of so much of feminist work. But before I move further into the realm of AI, I actually want to take a little bit of time out to just talk about what I mean when I say feminism. And, I'm doing this because I think it's really important to agree on some common terminology and also just level set, right? Because most people, if they know anything about feminism, they think that feminism is about women. And that's right, that's correct. Feminism at its core does entail a belief in equality for all genders. And this very crucially involves women and men, as well as non-binary folks, cis people, trans people, everyone, right? But if you take a look around you, you realize that this goal of equality, it's not yet realized in the world. And in the past couple of weeks, we've seen some really tragic instances of this. Um, and so this brings me to the second definition of feminism, which is that it also, and crucially for Maya and Catherine's definition, necessarily involves organized activity on behalf of women and non-binary people to make this goal of equality the reality in the world. And then feminism has a third definition, which is a set of theories and ideas. And these theories also began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender, but the past 40 years of scholarship, the current and persistent political reality, these things have brought many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include race, these include class, these include sexual orientation, ability or disability status, immigration status, and more. And so this brings me back around to this idea of intersectional feminism. And again, this is a term that I think at this point in the year 2024, most people are familiar with. But again, I think it's important to say out loud, this comes to us from the work of women of color feminists and from Black feminists in the United States in particular. And what feminists gain broadly from concepts like the Kampahi River Collective's formulation of, quote, interlocking systems of oppression, Kimberly Crenshaw's term intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins's idea of the matrix of domination. These are all conceptual frameworks that structure critiques of power. So they let you sort of atomize the reasons why certain people might experience oppression on the one hand or privilege on the other. And then I guess the other important thing to say about intersectionality is that the intersection comes from the view that it's not possible to isolate certain forces of privilege or oppression from others. So we might be interested in the effects of sexism, for example, but we need to recognize that other forces like racism, like classism, like colonialism, and so on, these forces interlock and intersect with each other in ways that are impossible to separate, and also notably in ways that compound their effects. And this will come back again because nowadays, you do see people trying to capture intersectionality in data collection and data analysis. And in many ways, this leads to just sort of like expanding the number of binary categories through which someone is described, right? Like, oh, we'll collect data on their gender, on their race, on their income level, on their location in the world, and so on. But if you're going to do an intersectional analysis of data or involving data, you need to be thinking, first of all, about how those categories interact with each other and influence each other. And second of all, the reasons why those categories matter in the first place, right? Which is that they're sort of, proxies for larger structures of power. In any case, what we do in the book is use this framework, this intersectional feminist framework, along with some other ideas that come from feminist activism and critical thought a bit more broadly, in order to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. So examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And our goal with trying to sort of articulate these principles was really to operationalize feminism for what was then data science, what we would now consider more broadly like data science and AI. We really wanted to provide a clear set of principles for people who were actually working with data, or for people, including students who wanted to work with data, or very crucially, a third group of people who wanted to refuse to work with data, sort of having done the reading and realizing that there were reasons to object or to opt out on ideological grounds. And so in the book, we have one chapter devoted to each principle where we talk about the feminist theory that underlies that particular principle and illustrate how it can be applied to data science through a lot of examples. So if you go read the book, that's what you will find. What I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is not actually to run through these principles, because you can find that information in the book. But what I want to think about is a couple of examples, some from the book and some that are more recent, that bring multiple of these principles together and that show us the reason why we should be thinking in a feminist way when we approach data and data science and AI. And, you know, the reason to do this now is that, these principles, they were formulated, I think, not I think, I know, before this sort of recent wave of AI hype and AI doom. And this conversation and its rise and prominence into the national conversation has brought even more considerations to the conversation. And I'm going to get to some of those at the end of my talk. But it's really important to still speak about data feminism to call us back to the idea that all AI and algorithms and large language models and what have you are ultimately and first powered by data. And many of the biases and inequalities that we see these models reproducing are actually directly connected to what Catherine and I term as data problems. And so what I want to do in the next little chunk of my talk is talk about two kinds of data problems. One is missing data and the other is biased data. And my goal is to really illustrate how these two data problems have very many downstream effects. So you can think about, like, when you're thinking about downstream effects, right? Right now, we have a little bit more nuance about how we discuss algorithmic fairness. So you might have heard, and this actually especially came up in the conversation around the ProPublica expose of the Compass recidivism algorithm. So this was an algorithm that assigned a risk score to people who were awaiting trial. So essentially an algorithm made a determination as to whether this person should be incarcerated, held in jail while awaiting trial, or whether bail could be issued and they could go home. And a lot of the conversation around that talked about the difference between optimizing an algorithm for what's called fair treatment, meaning that every person who is given a score, everyone who enters into the algorithm is treated the same. Or the other half of that, fair outcomes, meaning at the end of the day, you want to look at the outputs and make sure that the outputs match up to the way that the world is experienced. And in the social science, political science, and now computer science realm, this has been revealed to be what people call an impossibility theorem. It's like these two, either having fair treatment or fair outcomes, you can't do both at the same time. You need to choose. But the thing is, whether you choose one or the other, you're still going to end up with significant biases. And the reason why is because both the treatment and the outcomes have to do with biased data, the same source. And so this is the problem of unequal power that begins our book. And in Data Feminism, we use the example of this artwork that you're looking at here, which is created by an artist who's also an educator named Mimi Onuoha. And we use this example to illustrate this issue. And she makes the point in two ways. First is as a GitHub repository. That's what you see on the right. This is just a screenshot, but it lists in the repository data sets that you would expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need, but in reality, they don't. And then the second way that she gets at this is through a physical artwork. It's an installation. It's actually a filing cabinet that's installed in a gallery. And the data sets here are the labels on these file folders. And the idea is you go into this gallery, you identify a data set that seems interesting to you or important. But then when you go to open the folder to learn more, the file folder is empty because the data sets are physically missing. And the point that Onuoha is trying to make in this piece is that, again, these data sets are missing for a reason. And the reason is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So who has this power? Generally speaking, it's governments, it's other moneyed institutions. And again, generally speaking, minoritized groups do not have the power to decide what data is collected. And so this is why a feminist approach to data and to AI needs to begin with this analysis of power, because far too often, the data sets that we can access, because they're the ones that have been decided to be collected, and then in turn, the models they're used to train, and then the research questions we can ask, the real world applications that that research gets enlisted in the service of in the end. All of these questions, all of these decisions have already been overdetermined and sort of more narrowly scoped by the imbalance of power in the world. And so another example of missing data sets that's actually quite profound is the example of feminicide. And in the book, we tell the story of someone named Maria Salguero. She's a Mexican citizen, and she identified the problem of missing data with respect to feminicide and decided to collect this missing data herself. So feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. Again, they include both cis and trans women. And a thing to know about them is that they are legally defined as crimes in very many countries, including Mexico. This is a global phenomenon. It just happens to be the country that we focus on here because of Maria's work. But at the same time that feminicide is defined as a crime in many countries, it is also very true that the state rarely systematically collects data on feminicide. And so this makes it very difficult to enforce the laws and provisions that are on the books. And, Salguero herself became very frustrated by this lack of action. And so she set out to, and has, at this point, she's been doing it for almost a decade. She single-handedly compiled the largest public archive of feminicides in Mexico. She spends 2 to 4 hours per day doing this, logging feminicides on this Google map that you see here. And she culls instances of feminicide from media reports, from reading newspapers. And this work is really important. It's helped families locate loved ones. It's provided data to journalists and to NGOs. And ironically, she's been called in to testify in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times because she, a private citizen, knows more about this problem that the government should be the one to pursue. And so in the book, we talk about this as a form of what might be called feminist counter data. So this is activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And it represents one way to use data to challenge power. But we've seen another facet of missing data play out really really visibly in the conversations around training data for large language models. So these are the models that drive apps like ChatGPT. And what we know about this training data, aside from it just being large, is that it comes from the internet. And the internet is many, many things, but one thing it is not is a full and equal representation of the world. So the internet skews young, it skews male, it skews towards the United States, and it skews towards toxicity. And so when you have people typing things into ChatGPT and interpreting the output as some sort of truth, you can immediately begin to see how a model that is trained on this data is not going to be this full and accurate representation of the world. But another thing we know about this is that the people putting together the training data for these models, like they also know this about their data. And so this is why people have become so frustrated when, for example, the paper released with GPT-4, which is what you see one of the screenshots about, did not disclose the data sets it had been trained on. And even now, we've seen actually just a week ago, AI2, the Allen Institute for AI Research, released a fully documented open source model. Hugging Face tried to do this earlier, maybe last year, with a model called Bloom. Stanford is doing something called the Model Transparency Index, which is trying to sort of rate and rank these models in terms of how transparent they are. Like, this is definitely welcome. We need this, right? We need more emphasis on better data set documentation, more open source models. But the thing is, until our world is free from bias, our data sets will not be. And so we will also continue to need theories like feminism that can help us understand how these biases work in the world so that we can first account for them and then ideally challenge and change them. But I want to turn now to another sector where algorithms are being deployed everywhere, which is housing. So the housing sector is experiencing the integration of a whole different, whole sort of host of technologies, many powered by AI, that include like credit scoring algorithms, remote property management dashboards, biometrics in order to gain access to buildings by renters, and more than that. Um, and one of the things that Catherine has been doing recently, well, I should have mentioned the large language model slide, that was some of my recent work, so we can talk about that later. But one of the things that Catherine has been doing recently is working with urban studies scholars to explore tenant screening services. So these are basically background checks that landlords can run on tenants. And they sound relatively harmless enough, but one of the things that they do is pull from eviction records and from arrest records. And these are both sources of data that are both extremely racialized in the context of policing in the United States, and also, even setting that aside, just like really bad quality, like extremely low. Um, but just to sort of make a broader point about this, you know, if we examine power across the housing sector, not just the tenant screening services, but all of these technologies being developed, what we find out is that, again, like there's so many and such a range of these tools that landlords can use to screen tenants, to monitor them, to surveil them, to control their access, and so on. But there's just a simple question that this prompts, which is why the landlords have so much data, so many algorithms, all of these systems on their side. They can know almost everything about their tenants, whereas tenants can know very, very little about their landlords. Like, what is their history of evicting people unfairly or not fixing broken things on the property? Where are the technologies and prediction systems that help tenants build power? Like, why are we not building those things? And so if you think about this sort of goal of challenging power in the context of housing data and housing AI, what this would mean would be stopping the use of discriminatory technologies like these screening services, and also designing technologies that help build tenant power and bring that together. So to take sort of even a higher level back, so how can we work towards this world in which AI systems are designed to rebalance unequal power rather than exacerbate it? And one of the nice things is that we actually have some examples here. So one possibility comes from fields like HCI and design, which each actually have quite long track records around public processes, about participation, and co-design. And in data feminism, we characterize these approaches as embracing pluralism, meaning listening and learning from a range of sources of knowledge. And we've actually started to see some of these practices of co-design show up in data science and in data-driven research. And so one of the things I want to talk about is more about what that means and what it could look like in the context of AI research and AI regulation. Because as these AI tools are developed sort of in a more concentrated way at the top, I think we're going to need to think a little bit harder and a little bit more pointedly about what models are shaping our research. And so I'm actually going to talk about another project of Catherine's, which really attempts to inhabit this principle of embracing pluralism. So this is a large-scale research and design project that Catherine has been working on since 2019. It's co-led with a couple of other investigators, Isadora Cruikshank, Silvana Fumega, and Helena Suarez-Val. And where Catherine and her team got this inspiration was actually from the work of Maria Salguero, and her work producing data about feminicide. And what the project sought to do was understand, first of all, how widespread that form of activism was and remains across all of the Americas, North, South, and Central America. And the answer is it's incredibly widespread. But then a secondary goal was to see how AI systems might be able to support these human rights activists in their work. And so I just want to underline the sort of different stages of participation and design here, because building a tool was not a foregone conclusion in this case. So Catherine and her team worked in brainstorming workshops for a really long time to discuss, first of all, whether or not And second of all, if so, how these AI tools could help streamline the activists' work or even just reduce the emotional toll of their labor for them. Um, but at the end, it's been this iterative process over, at this point, 3 years, and there's actually now two tools that are being used by more than 40 human rights monitoring groups. And notably, they engaged the groups in these participatory sessions at very early stages, as well as coming back to them for data annotation, as well as for tool evaluation. Um, and there's a lot, this is a whole other project. You can actually go to the website and read all of the work on this. But one of the interesting things to me, as someone who's been sort of adjacent to this work, is that the groups didn't actually want to fully automate their feminist side work. And that was because the activists consider their work to be care work. They really understand part of what they do, an important part, as stewarding the memories of these killed women. So refusing to let them be forgotten, either by the state or by the media. And because of that, they didn't want to just delegate the task to AI. Where AI became useful was just in reducing the noise, like the articles about other forms of violence that they might have seen if they were just personally searching for feminicide, and being able to focus their work on what they actually wanted to be doing at that time. So this brings me back to another principle from data feminism, which has to do with the importance of elevating this work of emotional labor and emotion and embodiment more broadly. Um, but in order to talk more about this, I actually want to take another detour back into feminist theory land. And I want to talk a little bit about how one of the main contributions of feminist theory has been to show how binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy, with one group on the top and other are on the bottom. So the gender binary is the most obvious example of this, with the idea of man and the idea of women. We know it's a false binary because we know there are more than two genders, right? But then once you start to perceive the hierarchy, you start to understand the reason why the hard line between those two groups is there in the first place. And it's essentially a method of control, right? It's the hard line is there is it in order to ensure that one group stays on the bottom and the other group is able to preserve its status at the top, right? If you start eliminating that hard line, then you start to get like all these people shuffling around, and it might not be true that people who preserve their power by just retaining a sort of narrow and binaristic identity were able to easily defend it. Um, but one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this sort of like the model of the critique of the gender binary and use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So you could think of like feminist pedagogy, which is always questioning the binary between teacher and student, right? It's like, well, why do we maintain that the teacher is at the top and the student is at the bottom when in the classroom we know that we are constantly learning from our students as much as we are teaching them. Um, or the reason that brought me here, the reason is reason, the binary between reason and emotion, right? Like, why do we insist that there's this hard line between what is emotion and what is reason? And more pointedly, why do we value rational technical work over emotional labor? Why is that hierarchy there? And the answer is it's preserving the status of the people who engage in one kind of work versus the other. So in the context of AI, one of the other things that this critique of false binaries and unequal hierarchies helps us do is cut through what is referred to increasingly in shorthand as like AI hype. And so you get these like swirling messages at the same time that we now see amplified in Congress, in the media, by companies like OpenAI and the like. So on the one hand, this belief that AI is good because it is rational and objective, unlike, deeply emotional and flawed and subjective human beings. So that's one thing. The other thing is, somehow simultaneously, it's so magical and mysterious that like, lowly humans, we can't possibly begin to understand how it works. So this is actually a power move. So, you know, these big tech companies, they want us to believe in these magical superhuman capabilities of their AI systems, because if they're too mysterious or too complicated for us to understand, these companies, they're let off the hook for the actual problems that these systems are causing in the world right now, which again, if you stop to think about it, have very clear and direct sources, again, like racism, like sexism, things like this. Um, so you could think over here, this is just a screenshot of one of the images in the famous "A Paper, Attention is All You Need." It was the paper that sort of like launched the transformer architecture that underlies a lot of these large language models. And so you have inputs. This is right down here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but like right below the pink box at the bottom are inputs. It goes through this whole model. It's very complicated. And ends up at the end with these output probabilities, right? And so that's what the output is. So um, the thing is, these inputs at the bottom, these are more accurately described as like racist and sexist inputs. And so the reason that we have these output probabilities that, for example, like are more likely to predict a he pronoun when describing a doctor or a she pronoun when describing a nurse. Like this is the reason why we have these output probabilities is not necessarily because of this complicated system. It's because of these larger structural problems that cause the data to be biased in the first place. Or for another example, there's incredible resistance on the part of tech companies like Amazon to believe that like what they believe to be like objective and accurate facial recognition models, the ones that they sold to police companies, would not then be used to further the racial inequality that's already embedded in the policing system in the United States, right? Like it's these companies being like, well, it's not our problem because our models are objective. But the thing is, the default settings for all of these AI systems, what they do is concentrate wealth and power. They accelerate discrimination and they scale oppression. Um, you know, the default settings for AI systems, if you come back to the example of the tenant screening systems, will always concentrate power in the hands of the already powerful. So throw technological heft behind landlords and leave tenants out in the cold. But we don't need to accept these default settings. And this idea of default settings, by the way, this comes from Ruha Benjamin, who's written a series of books, including one called Imagination, which is out maybe now, maybe recently, but she has another book called Viral Justice and another one um, about technology as well. And so her point is that like these are just the defaults, but we don't need to accept them. And so this brings me to the final point that I want to make before the Q&A, and I hope it's by now pretty obvious. It's that data and data systems and AI systems, they need data feminism and even more. Um, you know, Looking back, what we wrote in Data Feminism about the centrality of power was like really sadly and depressingly prescient. Um, and one of the things that Catherine and I have talked a lot about is how in the past couple of years, the growth of these models and their increasing requirements for computing power, not only did they sort of underscore the centrality of power, but there are even more considerations that we need to be thinking about right now. For one, the environmental costs of training these systems, which take weeks and months on the most powerful of computing clusters. We've heard about their energy requirements. We've heard about their water requirements for cooling. And while there are some really great people already working in this space, we need more. We need climate scientists. We need environmental studies scholars working with people in the data science and AI world in order to understand and intervene into this issue. And then there's really profoundly human costs, right? So we've known for several years about the role that Amazon has played in providing cloud storage for ICE. This was in the news. We know about how Google developed technology to make drone strikes more accurate. This was Project Maven. This was also in the news because Google employees uh, uh, protested enough so that Google stopped pursuing this project, except not until they sold it to the US government, right? And now we're watching, we in the world, we're watching at what's happening in Gaza right now, and we're hearing about how Israel is deploying these same object recognition algorithms from the United States in order to make military actions, more efficient and more accurate. And I think one of the really important role that tech research groups like DARE, DAIR, publications like Logic Magazine, they're reminding us, and they're providing a really important role in doing so, how, ultimately the use case for so many innovations where the rhetoric is about benefiting humanity, actually these technologies are designed and deployed with the goal of literally destroying humanity instead. But I do want to try to end on a note of hope. And there's no good way to make a transition to that. But these AI systems, they're incredibly powerful. I've said this a lot today. But they're only as powerful as the data on which they are trained, the conditions under which they are developed, and the context in which they're put to use. And if we are going to imagine an alternative set of conditions for their development, alternative contexts and ideas for their deployment, contexts that might empower, not disempower, then we really do need feminism. We need intersectional feminism. We need anti-colonial feminism. We need all of these feminisms coming together in a very, very clear role. And this is an interventionist role. It's a political role because it's a role that needs to directly challenge these default settings, both of data sets and the models that produce them, the predictions that result, the systems that are designed. And the goal is really to work towards technology that works towards liberation and not just wealth extraction. And so that's where I'm going to end here. I'm going to switch to just one more slide. If you'd like to be in touch with me after this talk, although I'm going to turn to the Q&A right now, here's a lot of different ways to get in touch with me and Catherine. I should update it. I'm on Blue Sky now too. And I don't know, all of the new social media platforms that I can't even keep track of. But thank you so much for listening, and I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts and your questions.
All right, thank you so much. So I have a question while we wait for some of the questions to populate in the Q&A. So thinking about activism and bringing issues to light in general, how do you see this happening when the algorithms in these technologies are so hidden and now even guarded?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really big issue, right? But I think the first step is to recognize that that is happening and that that is intentional, right? So what we have, and I think we've observed this a lot over the past year, is companies like Facebook, companies like Google, like being called into Congress and being asked, like, how do we regulate you? Just tell us how to do it. We're ready. We want to make the laws, like, tell us what to do. And of course, these companies, because they don't want to be regulated by the government, are saying like, oh no, it's so complicated. You can't possibly figure it out. Oh, just trust us, right? And we've seen, for example, like with the airline industry, what happens when industries are allowed to regulate themselves, like doors fly out of airplanes mid-flight. We do not want this for AI. And for that matter, like we kind of already have this in the way that ChatGPT has just been unleashed on the world, in the way that Facebook was allowed to manipulate its algorithm and ultimately influence the 2016 election. Like we've seen all this before. So I think the first step is really to uh, sort of call that out, to be like, no, 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 like we need regulation. And I actually think, as someone who did not begin my academic career thinking that I would come down on the side of like, what we need is big government to regulate these big companies. Like this is a surprise to me to recognize that I think this is what the solution is. But that's number one, is to say like, these companies are so powerful. The only thing that can possibly stop them at this point is the government. But to go from like top down to little things, like one of the things that we can do just on a day-to-day level is to try to choose to use open source, well-documented versions of these things over the closed and proprietary ones. And I definitely recognize how working within a state system in the tech space, like you don't often have this choice. Like I forget if I mentioned this, I did grad school at CUNY and I taught there for a while. And like it's this constant battle between the platforms that you need to use system wide that are proprietary, that are covered under a general license. And then sometimes they tell you like you can't use like a WordPress or whatever an open source thing is. But to the extent possible, trying to give users to these companies that are trying to build things with a more public interest in mind. Maybe I'll stop there because I see a couple of other questions getting into the chat, but like that's the really big issue right now, this question of regulation, the like, how do you get like, you know, people like to feel like the cat's out of the bag, but it's like, still gotta deal with the cat, you know? So what we do from here moving forward.
Great. And what guidance would you give young women regarding utilizing AI for educational purposes like research or writing, protecting their data or understanding how their data is used?
Oh, that's a good one too. I mean, I think like, you know, in a sentence, like if you don't write, like we know this phrase, like if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. Anything you type into a free version of anything will then become used by the company itself. And so students should know that, employees should know that, like ChatGPT and whatever, unless you are paying for the enterprise version. And I don't pay for it, so I don't know, but my guess is that you really need to read the fine print there as well. But just assume that your data is not private. Assume that the company is trying to make money off of your unique expertise and go into any interaction with these AI systems with eyes wide open to that fact. Then the second thing that I would say is, you know, like we should, on the one hand, not be scared of experimenting with them, figuring out what they can do, because a lot of this like magical, mystical aura comes from the fact that we're not familiar with what they actually do and don't do. And we just listen to the media, to the company's own PR. You know, one of the things I was talking about earlier, it's like now that I've had students, a lot of students try to write essays using ChatGPT, like you can tell how bad it is. It doesn't write good essays. They're really boring. They're not at the college level. And, you know, after only a couple of minutes or hours of spending time with this, you're like, I'm not going to use this thing for hardly anything because it's not actually very good. And so that's another thing, another strategy that I would say. And same thing with students, right? You know, like they're not going to not try it if they think that it's easier or might save them some time. So let them play around with it. Let them figure out what the concerns are, what the uses might be. And I actually, especially like on the coding side of things and the ways in which people can be more sophisticated users, I like students to show me what they're figuring out and try to figure out, like, again, you know, what are the uses and then what are the limits?
Great. Another question here. Where is the responsibility of the data consumer? How do we develop data literacy? Just as we teach critical reading of media, we can teach how to evaluate data. Do you think this is something that needs to be added to basic curriculum?
Yeah, totally, 100%. And I think that we're getting there. You know, I've noticed at the high school level, students will often have um, some sort of something about data, like a little bit of basic data literacy, either collecting data or learning how to make a chart, even just like in Microsoft Excel or something like that. And I do think that there's a growing awareness of the need for this kind of thing. There's not quite the broad set of resources. You know, obviously we haven't had, you know, decades of a field in order to develop research around all the different ways you can do this. But there are, you know, enough resources at this point to get started. And so I think just sort of building this into curricula, encouraging it, supporting it, and telling students or like making the connection for students, like why it matters. Not just like, oh, this was this independent thing that you learned in a class that is never useful, but actually, no, this information that you learned several years ago applies in this context and the other one.
All right, what can we as working professionals do to support feminist efforts in AI? Probably a little bit of a nuance of a question that you previously answered to.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, to me, the question would be like, you know, one is you could like read the book and think about the ways in which all the different principles, you know, you might see which ones are most directly relevant to your work, and which ones, maybe are a little bit further afield. But I think even more broadly, like thinking sort of about those three levels of feminism. So one is like inclusion, like, am I actually being inclusive? Like, let me take a look around at who's on my team, who I'm choosing to partner with, and who I'm choosing to mentor and give my time to, and do the work so that I can make just a more inclusive set of people. Um, Across all genders, that hopefully we can all, work together with the sense of mutual respect, towards a goal. The second, I think, is to be ready and develop a vocabulary for talking about some of the structural reasons why we might not be in that place in which we exist in a world where, for example, like wit needs to exist and you're all like super excited to get together. One of the things that I think is really helpful is just having a lot of practice of sort of ways to bring up issues with both representation, but also the structural reasons why those things might not exist in ways that are sort of like not confrontational and that are heard by our broader audience. But I think the flip side of that is also like developing a thicker skin so that if you screw up, you on the one hand, like don't beat yourself up and just try again next time. But on the other, if you get pushback, you can sort of tell yourself like, that's okay. I believe these things. I'm going to work on articulating them. Um, in a way that is heard for whatever audience that I'm in. And I will certainly, because of the way of the world, have an opportunity to try this again better. And then to connect to the third thing, like actually, I dismissed reading the book, but we actually like that's sort of the point of the book, which is like there's ways that are both more legibly connected to questions of women, but there's also ways of working in a feminist way, like trying to be more attentive to all the different forms of labor that go into any particular tech project and making sure those forms of labor are valued. Trying to think about ways in which, for example, in data collection, we might lean towards collecting data on things that are more quantitative rather than qualitative, or things that seem to be captured by numbers as opposed to things that might register emotion or even color, or just sort of some of the things that our basic data structures were not designed to do. So there's also work thinking pluralistically about how it, like I talked about this a little bit in the talk, all sorts of ways. So would direct you there.
And how do you suggest that we can effectively influence students and younger generations, as well as the decision makers who are falling for closed AI with all of its biases? And this person says in their experience, many people hear the concerns about biased data as just someone who is too old and doesn't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, okay, so let's see, let's back up. So actively influencing students, I think honestly, that just like show up, be visible, be present. I think it really matters to students. I'm sure you hear this as well, but students, like who they see doing these jobs, they notice that and it matters to them. So, keep on doing what you're doing. I think, influencing decision makers, um, I mean, that's honestly, I feel like I don't influence decision makers. All of y'all probably have more experience doing that than I do. But honestly, like cite the scholarship, right? Cite the research. There is so much work out there that points to how there are, like myriad biases in these systems, not just gender, but also in terms of like language spoken, location in the world. I saw a paper recently that was talking even about how not explicit bias, but even just like certain types of sentence construction was evaluated differently by these models because of the way in which we have sort of a hierarchy of types of speaking in our culture. There's a way, I wish I knew offhand, um, resource that was collecting a lot of these newer papers in the past year or two about all the different biases in these AI systems. And I don't, but there are just so many of them because there's so many biases. And so I think, cite the work. I think news outlets like ProPublica, and there's an increasing the markup, there's an increasing array of like data journalism and also tech reportage oriented companies that do more like public facing reportage on some of these studies. It doesn't need to be just like your opinion that these things are biased. There's so much evidence backing that up.
Great. And you talked about location in the world earlier too. This person, a question asker, is curious to hear more about the intersection with different people in different places globally, e.g. those in developing countries and or under authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of like AI, this shows up in a couple of different ways. So I think, one of the ways in which people initially began to look for questions or relationships between like developing countries like global north, global south, sort of replicating colonial uh, configurations in the world was in the hierarchy of computational work that was being replicated in these systems, where you have excuse me, the engineers in the global north, in particular, in the United States, in California, and you have people who are doing the data cleaning, the content moderation, all of the work that's perceived to be like lower level elsewhere in the world, because the companies can get away with paying less money for it. Most notably, when the first version of ChatGPT was launched, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, it's so amazing. Look at these responses. They're so human-like. Within a week, I believe it was like Time or People. It was like a major uh, news outlet, and it wasn't even like a serious one. It was just like a magazine. Someone can find it, but revealed that there was actually an entire team of workers in Kenya who were being paid to do real-time content moderation and being like woefully underpaid for this job. And the minute that the news article came out, OpenAI fired all of them because they wanted to avoid additional attention to the fact that they were exploiting these workers. And there's now actually an ongoing lawsuit about this. But the other thing that happens, I was talking before about how like we don't really know what's in the data that trains these models, but I mean, like that is true at the level of, individual web pages themselves, but it's not true about the big chunks of it. And so one of the things that we know about like one of the big data sets that's used to train something like GPT-4 is called the Common Crawl. And one of its biggest chunks is all of Wikipedia. And so one of the thing, the second biggest chunk is fan fiction. But we can bracket that one. We'll come back to that. But like what we know about Wikipedia. So the authors of Wikipedia are 90% male. Because of that, the people who are covered in Wikipedia also exhibit a gender skew, with male writers more likely to write articles about male people. We also know that the age demographic of people who contribute to Wikipedia is 19 to 24. So these are the experts, right? And Wikipedia, like it's, so as a researcher, it's a little bit depressing to me that like now Wikipedia is like the best quality data that we have in this data set. But so these experts are men located in the United States, writing in English between ages 18 and 24. And so you can just think about how the worldview that is represented by this particular author, again, like it's not biased necessarily in and of itself, but it's only a narrow slice of the global population. But because this is the data that is being used to generate these probabilities of like what word or what sentence should come next, you end up with the most likely or the most probable output being one that adheres to that worldview. So I've seen really interesting work. Well, first of all, there's the fact that like most of these models are trained on English language data, and the fact that they can do translation or give responses in other languages, is just because like some other non-English language data sort of like gets in the mix. There are fewer models that are trained natively in other languages, so they work less well. But there's also questions of like, even within the domain of English, like which English is prioritized, right? Like Indian English, US English, British English. There are all these quality filters that look for certain grammatical constructions that are the ones preferred by people in the US speaking like the dominant form of English, and exclude the other sentence constructions that are used elsewhere in the world. And so there's these really tricky and complicated biases at all sorts of levels that enter into these data sets, again, sort of like with the presumption, because this is what these companies want you to believe, that these AI technologies are like all powerful, coming from a neutral perspective, just giving you the thing that is true, right? And this is not true at all. It's coming from a particular place.
Great. We have time for one final question. So as a scientist working on data feminism, is there funding in this area? What does that look like? Are there grants and organizations funding this work?
Yeah, there are actually. We've been really, really pleased to see that feminist scholarship in a lot of different fields has been funded by the NSF, by the Sloan Foundation, by a bunch of other funders. And I can think here of, off the top of my head, I've seen stuff in environmental studies, I've seen stuff in statistics pedagogy, I've seen stuff in the quanti side of urban studies and urban planning. Um, and so, the good news, I think, is that this work is being funded. To me, the goal from here on out is to try to get these approaches and these methodologies and these frameworks, not just like a small sort of like, oh, this is a different way of doing research, or this is a alternative way, but to sort of make this the mainstream to convince everyone that this is how everyone should be doing their work.
That is gives me a lot of optimism. So thank you for sharing. I'm going to come on camera to close us out. So again, sincere thanks to you, Dr. Klein, for coming here and sharing your expertise with everybody. I am going to, sorry, my dog is barking. Hope you can't hear that. If you, before you leave, if you could fill out our 1-minute survey, that would be wonderful. The link is in the chat. So if you need to click on that a little more easily, you can do that by opening the chat box. Or you can point your phone at the QR code and scan it. And again, we are seeing comments pop up in the chat in the Q&A as well, Dr. Klein, with many thanks to you. So just wanted to send those along to you. All right, I'll leave the QR code for a few more seconds and we'll say goodbye. Thank you again. Have a great day, everybody. Happy International Women's Day.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone.